Okay, in this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the reasons to believe in a personal God. So, this is something that comes up a lot, whether God is personal, what kind of God are you talking about? We talk about believing in a God or any God. Now, there's no doubt that God's existence impacts every area of our lives. It impacts the way we view reality. It impacts our view of value. Why do people matter? It impacts morality and ethical choices. It impacts the question of where we come from. It impacts the question of destiny, where are we going, what happens to us when we die. It impacts the issue of identity. What do we find our core identity in? Is it in politics? Is it in our sexuality? Is it in something else? Is it in our career? Is it in uh, our gender, whatever it is? So it also impacts the issue of purpose. Why are we here? Why do we think we're here? What are we doing on this earth? Um, so the God question impacts all these issues, and so we need to be aware and cognizant of the fact that God's existence is a huge question. It's the question of all questions. Of course, it's been debated forever. Now, some people say, well, you can't prove God's existence, and therefore I'm just going to be agnostic. Well, in response, we need to remember there's deductive arguments or inductive arguments or abductive arguments. Arguments are generally laid out with two premises and a conclusion, a syllogism. And of course, we have been giving deductive and inductive and abductive arguments for God's existence for a long time. Now, of course, you'd have to look at those premises and conclusion and ask whether they're sound and valid and all those issues. But to say you can't prove God's existence just communicates, it makes us ask the question, what do you mean by prove? Do you mean prove deductively or inductively or abductively, right? So just make sure I just want to make sure we understand that when we talk about the word proof and proving God's existence. Now, remember, when it comes to proving God's existence, there's also a difference between proofs and persuasion. That means that somebody may find something, may look at the evidence or the syllogism or the argument and say, yeah, that's a strong proof, and I'm persuaded. Other people may look at it and say, I'm not persuaded. But we need to remember that persuasion is different. Persuasion is more subjective. It has to deal with you take in your presuppositions, your worldview, your biases, and all those things go into your ability to understand the arguments. So that's why many people are persuaded by the proofs, and obviously someone might say, well, many people are not persuaded. It's not that everything's subjective. It's just that, the evidence is there. The evidence is objective. The question is the way we interpret the evidence and the factors we take into looking at the proofs or evidence. Okay. So just remember that when we talk about trying to prove God's existence. Now, when I say there's some reasons for a personal God, as I'm going to go over right now, I'm talking about a being that is endowed with rationality, self-consciousness, and volition. That means they have the ability to exercise their will. And these are the usual sort of qualities associated with being a person. We have these things as humans, obviously, but we're talking about it being a personal God that would have those characteristics as well. And there's no doubt the way we come into relationships with other people, personal relationships, if we look at this, I think we all know that it takes initiation, meaning that a personal being would, or a person or someone we know, if we want a relationship with somebody, one of us has to initiate contact or communication through speaking verbally or writing something down or texting or emailing, whatever it is. The point is that we generally have to do something to form that relationship. We have to initiate it, okay? Or someone may initiate it with us, someone may introduce us to somebody else, but then the question is whether we will be able to receive that communication. Now, there's no doubt, if you use the way of analogy, if you want to look at it by an analogy, that if God wants to communicate to humans, he wants us to know what he's like, he's going to have to pick a medium to communicate, meaning that he would have to pick, just like we pick email and talking and writing and all those things, God would have to pick some sort of medium. The question is, what is the medium, and whether we will receive the desire for God to communicate to us. Will we receive that communication, reject it? Because just like human relationships, we can reject those, blow them off, ignore them. We can do that with God as well. Now, some people really get caught up into, of course, they want to know what approach they should take to find God, because most people don't know because we don't teach it. And that's going to depend on what God is. What is God's nature? How do we investigate the existence of God if we don't even know what the object is like? For example, the things around my room right now all have materiality. They're physical: tables, chairs, books. And the question is whether God fits into that category. I mean, I can investigate my marble table right now. I can look at it and feel it and see that it consists of marble, right? But what kind of object is God? How would we know what God's nature is like? And the question is, can we know the nature of God unless he shows us, right? So people get caught up on this. They don't really know what they're investigating or what they mean by God. And then they try to come up with some way to find God. And it can be kind of tricky sometimes. Now, some people talk about the incomprehensibility of God. That means that God is so infinite that a finite being can't fully grasp or fully contain the infinite. And it is true that if we're talking about a personal God, we're talking about an infinite being. And we, of course, as finite humans, cannot fully grasp an infinite being, no doubt about it. Now, the question is, if God is incomprehensible, meaning that he's an infinite being, it would really beg the question as to whether he's going to help us. If he wants us to know what he's like, would we need some help? And the answer is yes, we do. And that's why we think God has chosen to reveal what he's like through certain mediums. He's chosen to reveal knowledge of himself through certain ways, certain means of communication. And we believe that God is primarily, as I'm going to talk about more about these things, but he's communicated about himself through the world of nature, through the natural world, meaning that we don't need the Bible to know God is personal. We don't need the Bible to know there is a God or a creator. You could observe the natural world and come to the conclusion there must be a creator. Then we ask whether God has spoken into history, whether he has communicated or revealed himself through a written text. And the question is, how should a personal God give knowledge of himself to humanity? If you're struggling to say, well, I don't know how to know God exists, what should a personal God do to show humanity what he's like? If God wants us to know what he's like, what should he do? You have to ask that question. Now, you may say, well, you should just give me a direct sign. You should just show me he's there. Well, if you've already ignored these two things, meaning you don't think there's any aspect of God in the world of, or the natural world, and any aspect of God in history anywhere, you've already ignored these two ways God's revealed himself. I'm not so sure God owes you any kind of sign. And even if he did give you a sign, it doesn't mean you're going to commit to him. It doesn't mean you're going to trust him. You could just say you're hallucinating, or you could just give God the middle finger. So there's no guarantee you're going to surrender to God through a personal sign. Now, as I said, some people think God needs to fit in these categories. Maybe he's like a table or a chair or a car or a house or something that has physical parts to it. You can see these things are put together by somebody else. You can examine the composition of them. They can be measured. They can be weighed. And some people assume that God's supposed to fit into these categories, and that's a problem, because if you don't know what the nature of God is, then you can't just assume he's supposed to fit into these categories like a physical object does. So sometimes the argument goes like this: if we can't see or empirically verify God's existence directly, God does not exist. Premise 2, we can't see empirically verify God's existence directly, therefore God does not exist. So let's talk about that. Now, there are many things that we cannot see with our eyes that we accept as being true. For example, we don't directly observe electrons, protons, neutrons, individual atoms, electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields, justice, consciousness of other human beings, or the wind. You don't see any of these things directly, observe them with your eyes. So, as I said, if none of these things are directly visible to us and they can't be verified visually or directly, someone could say, well, wait a minute. As I say, number 2 here, you can infer the existence of electrons by the behavior of charged particles, or you can infer the existence of electric fields or magnetic fields by the behavior of charged particles, and infer the existence of the wind by seeing the branches on the tree moving, and you are correct. And that is why we think that you can similarly infer the existence of God from his effects in the world, which are all around us. So while we don't see God directly, we observe his effects, and we make inferences the best explanation. For example, if you were to look on these two charts right here about these features of reality, as a person who doesn't believe in a personal God and a person who does believe in a personal God can do, we can make an inference. We can look at these and ask, what is the best explanation, or what is the correct inference? Does the inference lead to a personal God or non-personal God? And you can just go right down the chart here on both sides and ask, which is the best explanation for the data we have. But everybody can look at these things. So it's not like we can't examine them and try to make the best inference, okay? We do that with these points too. For example, is morality the result of a blind, impersonal, non-moral force that stands behind purely human conventions? Is human value the product of valueless, purposeless, and accidental natural processes and forces? Or does human value come from and worth and dignity come from a personal God? So we can do this. It's called inferring to the best explanation. That's what we can do. Now we can debate these things, each one of these categories. That's fine. But just like you can't see those things directly, I talked about, you can't see God directly. That's true. But you can look at the effects in the world and ask, what's the best explanation for these effects? Now, when we talk about design arguments, whether it be like the design of the universe or the design of the DNA code or something, we're defining that as where we look at something, we say, well, there seems to be a specific object or event that can't be the result of unguided natural processes. Or we might say a specific object or event can't be the result of chance or coincidence. And we're concluding that a causal agent is involved, a being with the ability to plan ahead who thinks with an end goal in mind. For example, we could look at certain things in the world of nature. We could look at certain things and ask whether there's no mind behind it, no intelligence, no creator. Is everything the result of undirected natural processes? Or is it the result of an intelligent being or intelligent mind? So we make inferences all the time. The question is, what is the best inference? And of course, scientific explanations only deal with impersonal objects and laws of nature. They observe and measure how events regularly follow each other. And there is no way impersonal forces can decide when to act. Impersonal forces can't create things or plan ahead a universe or things like that. So science only deals with that category, whereas personal or agent explanations, like we are agents as well, have to do with an intention, a will, and we have a desire to carry out a purpose. So we can choose one action over the alternatives. And so we make the choice when considering the future. So there's different kinds of explanations out there, but to say science can answer everything is incredibly reductionistic, and science only deals with impersonal explanations. It doesn't deal with personal agent explanations. So that's why we need philosophy, we need theology, we need other fields to explain reality other than just science. Now let's look at one design argument here. It goes, if the universe is fine-tuned for life on Earth, the best explanation for the fine-tuned the universe is a personal God. The universe is fine-tuned for life on Earth, therefore the best explanation for the fine-tuned the universe is a personal God. And so you look at some of the terms of the fine-tuning argument. We talk about the constants of the set values that don't change, like gravity or electromagnetic force. Fine-tuning refers to the fact that the constants and quantities in those formulas or laws of nature must fit an extraordinary narrow range to sustain life. And life refers to anything that can take in food, extract energy from it, grow, adapt to its environment, and reproduce. There's been a slew of books written on the fine-tuning argument. If you look at the middle one there, A Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes, he has done some debates. He's answered a lot of the objections to fine-tuning argument. You can go online and watch his videos or discussions with other physicists, but that's one of the more current books, as well as the one Signpost to God, but plenty of resources out there. There's not a lot of debate whether the universe is fine-tuned among professional physicists, even ones that are not theistic in their view. Even Stephen Hawking believed the universe is fine-tuned. So the question is, what's the explanation for the fine-tuning? For example, this physicist right here said, if we nudge one of these constants just a few percent in one direction, stars burn out with a million years of their formation. There's no time for evolution. And if we nudge it a few percent in the other direction, no elements heavier than helium form, no carbon, no life, not even any chemistry, no complexity at all. And remember, before you even get to biological evolution, you need the right universe, a life-permitting universe, a fine-tuned universe. You need the right Earth, a fine-tuned planet, and you need to show how the supposed Origination of living organisms come from lifeless matter. How did inorganic lifeless matter give us life? Now you may ask yourself, well, why do we need advanced planning? Why would a universe need to be planned out perfectly? Why would an intelligent agent want to do that? Well, obviously, if an intelligent being or a personal God wants sentient, self-aware, reasoning personal creatures exist, then there's going to have to be a fine-tuned universe in order for life to get going on planet Earth. And of course, planet Earth is fine-tuned as well, as these books talk about. So yeah, it takes tremendous planning. If you think about the amount of planning you do in your own life, whether it be planning your education, your health, your will, your family's planning, or governmental planning, the list goes on. Multiply that by what it would take to plan out a universe set up for life on Earth, and then to get Earth a certain way, to plan Earth. So I would say that the planning would surpass anything we do as humans, but yet we seem to think that there's still some sort of impersonal cause behind the fine tuning of the universe that takes no intelligence. Very interesting. Now, does fine tuning lead to a personal God? Well, fine tuning implies that the causal agent who designed these features for the existence and benefit of human beings is, at very minimum, many orders of magnitude more intelligent, knowledgeable, and inventive and creative and more powerful than humans. And of course, since intellect, knowledge, and intentiveness, creativity, and power attributes that only a personal being can possess, the causal agent creating the universe must be a personal being. Remember also about the laws of nature. When we think about the laws of nature, which science needs to even do science, right? Because science is study of the natural world and natural causation. But the premise one is the laws of nature cannot be the ultimate explanation of the cosmos because they cannot explain themselves. Therefore, the laws of nature require an explanation for their existence beyond nature and its laws. Therefore, the best explanation is a causal agent, as a lawgiver who created the cosmos according to mathematical principles. Paul Davies said in his article back in 2007 called Taking Science on Faith, he's more of an agnostic physicist, but he said all science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational, intelligible way. Davies observed the scientists take the orderly laws of physics on faith, and those laws are all expressed as tidy mathematical relationships. He then asked the question he's not supposed to ask: where do these laws come from, and why do they have the form they do? And of course, he got lambasted by atheists for asking that question. But basically, he's saying that science starts on faith as well, because you don't have any science without those laws of nature. And since we don't know where those come from and why they're so orderly in order to do science, they both take it on faith, or we take physics on faith as well. So the point is that before the beginning of the universe, there was no nature, there were no laws of nature, and this is when science begins. But science cannot explain the origin of the laws of nature, since the laws of nature are, by definition, descriptions of the way nature works. Such laws cannot exist if there is no nature for them to describe. So there has to be something outside the laws of nature to bring the laws of nature into existence. You can't say nature made nature, the laws of nature made nature. That doesn't make any sense. And this brings us to the point of the beginning of the universe, and modern cosmology has shown there is a cosmic beginning, refuting a materialistic explanation, because a contingent and temporarily finite nature, including space, time, matter, and energy, cannot explain itself. So its explanation has to be a timeless, spaceless, and immaterial personal agent with free will, because otherwise a timeless cause would only have a temporal effect, could not have a temporal effect. Now, these guys came up with their theorem here, Board, Guth, and Vilenkin. They said any universe that has on average been expanding through its history cannot be infinite in the past and must have a past space-time boundary. And so they basically, their theorem basically showed the universe had to have a beginning. Now, so obviously, I know there's people out there trying to find a way out of a cosmic beginning. They're trying to find other models to get rid of the beginning, because if there's a beginning point, that's going to cause problems, whereas they're going to have to ask what caused it. But remember the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either a necessity of its own nature or an external cause. We generally don't just look at things and say, well, they just popped into existence, who cares? I mean, generally we want explanation for why something exists. That's just part of life and part of reality, and why the principle of sufficient reason holds in so many cases. Now, what would be the cause at the beginning of the universe? Well, for the external cause of the universe, whatever a cause is, it must be beyond space time and therefore cannot be physical or material. But there's only two things that fit that description, that being abstract objects like numbers or else an intelligent mind. And abstract objects cannot enforce a will, they don't have any volition, they can't exercise a choice. And to bring the universe from into existence would involve a being that exercised a will, exercised a choice. And so that would have to be a personal agent, an intelligent, personal intelligent mind. These things are talked more at greater depth in Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, by the way, if you want to get that book. Also remember the contingency argument, and this argument says that objects and things are classified as contingent or dependent beings. A contingent being is something that's caused, sustained, finite, has an intermediate explanation, whereas a necessary being would be uncaused, self-sustaining, eternal, and is the ultimate explanation. Now, everything in our universe is really contingent or dependent on something else, because at the beginning of the universe is when the material universe came to existence, that became a dependent entity. And ever since then, there's been contingent things after that. Now, the question becomes, if you only had contingent things, if you had a contingent being bring a contingent thing to existence and everything was contingent, you'd have an infinite regress, obviously. You would need a being that would be outside the universe, a non-contingent being, a necessary being that would have to bring the contingent universe into existence, some cause that isn't contingent, otherwise you'd have an infinite regress. So that's just another, argument thrown in there in relation to the beginning of the universe. But a necessary being definitely is the best explanation, of being that is self-sustaining. And so nature is not dependent on anything else. So that's why I think you need a necessary being to start the universe. Now, sometimes people throw in the God of the gaps arguments. They say that, you can't invoke God to explain any gap of nature or reality. If you do, that's God of the gaps, and science will fill that gap of knowledge eventually. We've done it in the past. They'll do it again in the future. That's a little too simplistic, because when people are putting God as an explanation in certain gaps of knowledge, it's based on the principle of uniformity. It's based on things, the causes in the present are like causes in the past. It's based on what we do know, not what we don't know. It's based on what we know the best explanation is for certain features of reality through inferential reasoning. And we know some effects always have the same kind of causes. Some effects always have intelligent causes, whether it be in the past or the present or the future. And furthermore, if you want to throw in the God of the gaps argument, I could just say, or we could say, well, maybe you're just doing nature of the gaps. You think that nature will fill in the gap of every form of knowledge. There's a natural explanation for everything. So you have your own gaps as well, and your own gap argument. Also, if you're going to start with your metaphysics and then try to use science as an epistemology here to back up your metaphysics, you may be getting them confused. Remember that metaphysics is a study of reality. It's a study of being, the study of essences. But if you make the claim that nature is all that exists and the natural world is all there is, that's not a scientific claim, that's a metaphysical claim. And then if you're going to use science as your epistemology, which is this theory of knowledge, to reduce all knowledge to the search for natural causes of the scientific method, remember the science is already the study of natural causation. They don't allow any intelligent causes or any supernatural causation. So you're already then using epistemology to back up your metaphysics. So you need to make sure that hopefully we're not doing confusing those things. So in some cases, you may just be doing metaphysics to begin with. Let's talk about human value, dignity, and morality. Now, there's no doubt that people have been fighting a lot more for human rights and justice over the last couple of years. It's been in the news a lot more about issues of injustice in the world and why humans matter so much and why we need to fight for this people group or that people group. And the argument goes, if humans have intrinsic value, dignity, and rights, the best explanation for the intrinsic value, dignity, and rights of humans is a personal God. Premise 2, humans do have intrinsic value, dignity, and rights. The conclusion is therefore the best explanation for intrinsic value, dignity, and rights of humans is a personal God. Intrinsic value means that humans possess objective value regardless of their situation, condition, social, economic status, productivity, skin color, and sex. The question is, can naturalism, materialism ground objective human rights, dignity, or value? For example, if a naturalist or materialist worldview, which says the universe was produced by mindless, non-conscious, non-moral, and personal processes, and that humans were produced by an undirected values process, how would that lead to grounding objective human rights, dignity, or value? After all, if man is ultimately only a higher form of an animal, there would be no immaterial world with abstract realities like higher laws, immutable rights, universal morality, and the highest authority we have access to is to each other. And the only source we have is science for truth. So it just, from a personal God, having a personal God in the mix is a much better explanation for why we fight so much for people and why we think human life is sacred. And that leads also to the argument about objective values and duties. Objective moral values and duties are binding, valid, and binding independent of human opinion. Premise 2, if a personal God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 3, objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore personal God exists. There's no doubt that people will complain all the time. They will say, well, that's not fair. That's not right. I want justice. That's morally wrong. That's evil. What the heck is wrong with people? We watch the news. We see things in social media. We just call out and say, that is wrong. I want justice. It's not fair. People seem to assume the difference between knowing what is fair and unfair. They seem to know the difference between what is just and unjust. And they seem to know the difference between what is morally right, morally wrong. The difference between good and evil. The question becomes, what is the standard that's being violated? They claim to be appealing to, they seem to be appealing to some sort of standard that provides a measure for good or bad or right or wrong. The question is, where does the standard come from? Is it from culture? Is it from yourself? Is it from some other source? And what is the authority behind it that has the right to enforce that standard? The question is also, are our moral judgments based strictly on our personal feelings, tastes, or opinions? That's subjective morality. Or with objective morality, are they influenced by something outside ourselves? Is there a moral law outside of ourselves that we're appealing to as the standard, right? So we noticed a couple years ago that this incident caused cities to be burned down, billions of dollars in damage, defunded police. And of course, the defunding of police, and now people want critical race theory taught everywhere. The question is that because it's just your opinion what happened to George Floyd was wrong, what happened to George Floyd was wrong, or whether is it based on something that happened to him is objectively wrong for all places, all times, all cultures? Is there a standard that you're appealing to outside yourself saying what was wrong that happened to George Floyd? Is there a moral law of some kind that was violated, or is it just based on your human opinion? We also notice that the personal nature of moral obligations, and that if moral values and moral duties, if they exist, reside in persons, not in inanimate personal things, or in personal things, they don't describe how things work between abstract objects or ideas, and they describe how things work between persons. So moral obligations, moral duties are personal, right? So to say an impersonal force led to moral obligations and duties is much harder to explain than a personal being the cause of that. Now, obviously, some people will posit evolution as the answer, but that gets more into subjective morality, not objective morality, because evolution doesn't lead to any kind of objective morality. So the question becomes, what's the best fit? And in our argument, we're saying, when it comes to explain things like justice, values, moral obligations, and fairness, a theistic worldview fits better than a worldview with no God. And moral obligations, objective human rights, are objective in the sense that they hold whether one wants them to hold or one wants to fulfill them. And then we ask, of course, is there evidence for personal God in history? We say, when has God revealed himself in human history? Where has God revealed himself in human history? Has he revealed himself in one of these monotheistic faiths or non-monotheistic faiths, or has he revealed himself in all of them? And of course, that's a debate. But some people say, well, maybe there's no way to know. Well, that's the lazy way out. because what you can do is look at the historical context for each of those faiths. What's the claim? What's the context? What's the claim they're making? Then all we have to do is weigh the evidence for each one and compare the evidence. What is the evidence for the claim? Are there historical documents? Are there witnesses? Can we trust the witnesses? Are the documents textually reliable? Is there archaeological evidence? You have to, look and go dig and see if which has the best evidence for it, right? So the argument goes, if the New Testament authors told the truth and Jesus is the Son of God who offers forgiveness of our sins. Premise 2, the New Testament authors told the truth. Conclusion, therefore, Jesus is the Son of God who offers forgiveness for our sins. And these books right here are two really good resources on evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and the story of Jesus. I don't have time to go over that right now, but you can start with those two. And then, of course, with the resurrection, if Jesus rose from the dead, that would show there is a personal God. The God of the Bible exists. Premise 2, Jesus rose from the dead. Conclusion, therefore, the God of the Bible exists. A personal God, right? In a debate with Gary Habermas, former atheist Anthony Flew, before he passed away, said that if it is a knowable fact that Jesus rose from the dead literally and physically, then it constitutes the best, if not the only reason for accepting that Jesus is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. So if Jesus rose from the dead, then the God of the Bible exists and there is a personal God. And if you can agree on these 3 points, as Mike Licona points out in his book, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe that Jesus had been resurrected and appeared to them. If you can agree within a few years after Jesus' death, Paul came to faith, what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. If you can agree with historical rhetoric, these 3 points, then we can talk about what is the best inference, what is the best explanation for the data. We've definitely been dealing with these naturalistic inferences for decades and years, talking about them. And of course, we can talk about whether the bodily resurrection is the best inference we can make, or explains the data better than anything else. So it's not that we can't go over it. The question is, what is the best explanation? And so, like I said, if Jesus rose from the dead and bodily resurrection happened, then game over, the God of the Bible exists. Now, if you have a problem with miracles, you say, well, I don't believe a personal God can intervene into history. I don't even know if that makes sense philosophically or anything. There's been more than enough resources on this topic, and some very, very strong philosophical arguments as well, answering David Hume's objections and other things. If you look at that far bottom right book, Hume's Abject Failure. But if you read books like Craig Keener's book, Miracles Today, and J.P. Moreland's book, there's a lot of documentation in today's world and other parts of the world, not just the West, because the West is more skeptical of God's divine activity. So perhaps we need to do a little more homework and not assume that God's not intervening in the world at all. And perhaps there's all kinds, the world is very big. Perhaps we need to look at some of these testimonies and documented cases and weigh the evidence. Or else you can get my book, The Resurrection of the Jewish Messiah. That's a book that's available on Kindle, I believe, for like $2.99. Just remember one last thing, that Christians do not use faith in order to discover knowledge. Rather, faith is a response to knowledge they've already obtained by some other means. We don't use faith to believe in a personal God. We don't have faith in faith. We respond to the knowledge God's given to us, that he has communicated to us, just like humans communicate to each other. We respond to that revelatory act that God's given us of knowledge of himself through the world of nature and the world of history. Now, we don't have to respond at all, but the point is, faith is our response to the knowledge that God has given us. So that's some reasons for belief in a personal God. There's a lot more to it, but I just wanted to share that with you today. Have a good day.